different.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to our session on digital education in Africa. I'm Aryn Baker of Time Magazine. Today we are joined by Temitope, who is head of MOOCs for Africa. For those who don't know, that's massive online open courses for the Swiss Institute of Technology. Then we have Fred Swaniker from the African Leadership University and Group. Then we have Minister Philbert Nsengimana, Minister of Youth and Communication Information for Rwanda. Then we have Rapelang Rabana, who is head of Rekindle Learning, which is an interactive learning platform. And then we have Colin McElwee from World Reader, which is an online digital library. Yeah? Okay. And just to let you all know, this is an interactive session. So you can tweet any comments or thoughts or questions to #digitaleducation. And we're also having a vote today. So the vote is on the screen. What role should digital technology play in African education? You can say not at all, only as an add-on to traditional education. It should be in every classroom, or only in higher education. To vote, you can go to, if I can get that for one moment for you. Oh, here we go. It's at wef.ch/vote. So weigh in now as we wait for results to come in. Minister, why don't we start with you? Can you frame the argument for us and give us your sense of what the state of education in Africa is today?
Well, thank you. I think Africa is facing two major challenges in education. Probably with I'll talk about a third one as well. One is access. Universal access to education remains a dream, and this is just something I borrowed from this report that Ericsson made, released just earlier today on ICTs and SDGs. Globally, there are 57 million school-going children who remain out of school, and a big part of those are in Africa. The second biggest challenge is quality education. So the question here for me really is about, can technology become a solution to those big challenges? And the third one I wanted to mention is about inclusion. Among those who remain out of the education system, many of them are young girls in different countries in Africa. So just a way of preparation for this panel, I was watching the most watched video on TED, which is from Sarah Robinson, about how education, the question on whether education actually kills creativity. And the conclusion from the very nice, hilarious talk is, education, the way it has been provided over the last centuries, actually kills innovation, because education has identified its objective as preventing people from making mistakes. From the very early age, they teach you not to make mistakes, and with that comes lack of creativity. And when I look at what is the purpose of education, we are preparing people for the jobs of the future, not even of today or tomorrow. And with the digital and the fourth industrial revolution coming up, the question for me, and I'm sorry to jump to conclusion, is not about whether or how, it's about when. I think there is a pressing, urgent need to transform how education is provided in Africa, but also globally.
Thank you, Minister. Do we have the results of the poll? Have we? Okay. Here we go. We can look up on the web. Wow. Fascinating. More than half of the voters, and this is globally, this is on the web, say 58%. Oh no, we're still moving around. I feel like this is a horse race. But more than 50% of people say it should be in every classroom. That's not what I was expecting. Well, Fred, let's talk to you. Is tech a solution? Should we have digital education in every classroom?
I believe that in the 21st century, you absolutely do, if you can afford to as a nation, right? Or if you're a school that have access to it, you should absolutely leverage digital technology as much as possible. It allows us to do things that we've never been able to do in the past. For example, in the olden days, students would go through learning for months and would never know how they were doing until the end of exam, until when they get an exam. And what that means that it's very hard to, students can often get left behind. But with technology today, we can track on every single day how someone is doing, and enabling us to identify those students who are struggling and make sure we intervene, and those who are bored and enable them to learn at their own pace and so forth. It allows us to overcome the massive challenge that we have in Africa, which is the lack of access of good teachers, where we're able to remove the big constraint that we have in Africa, which is we don't have enough qualified teachers, by leveraging technology to bring the world's best teachers into the hands of the students. And therefore, we're able to actually allow students to drive their own learning, and you're able to allow them to teach each other as peers. But we're equipped with a base of knowledge. So we are sitting at a time, I believe, very similar to when the mobile phone came to Africa. And we were able to use it to leapfrog from going from 400,000 phone lines to 800 million in 15 years. And I think that the impact that they had in developing Africa, if we leverage technology, we can see a similar impact in the development of Africa in this generation.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you raise. But one of the questions, you work in higher education, you focus on higher education. What about at the very bottom? We talk about the second Millennium Development Goal, which is universal education for primary school. Do you think, maybe perhaps Temi, you can weigh on this, do you think that digital has a role in elementary or pre-primary?
Definitely. The key thing that education or that digital technology is bringing is if we look at it like transforming business models or transforming models, even in classroom, at some point that will redefine even what classroom is, but that's a different subject. Going forward, we have lack of teachers. Students are in remote places. Most of them, or many in villages, are poor, and they cannot afford to have a school even, talk less of teachers. So I think, and part of something that we are working on is actually to see how can education technology be used even at the lowest level, where kids can be prepared by parents, homeschooling, for example, equipping parents in homeschooling to actually take turns to train their children. And you can find that, which means that you can put a school in a village where there is no infrastructure, where there is no teachers, and you can transform the mothers into teachers that actually teach their kids because you're able to put the best content in their hands. So for me, there's no question about digital in education. It's the way to go, and it's going to change fundamentally. We're just scratching the surface.
Putting education, putting the information in the hands of parents. Rapelang, what about you? Do you think that digital could eventually replace teachers?
I think there's certainly a place for digital learning tools, and I'm not of the group that believes it's a silver bullet that will solve everything, and I don't think it's the right question to ask ourselves, are we trying to replace teachers? It's much more important, I think, to understand where we can use technology to add value to the learning process. I mean, if we were looking at a different industry, for example, and you were trying to improve healthcare, you wouldn't try to remove all the doctors or replace everything with digital tools. You would ask yourself, where are the biggest problems and where can we apply technology to solve that? And similarly in learning, I think we should take a much deeper look and understand from learning pedagogy which learning activities can actually benefit from technology more, as opposed to just assuming that all learning can happen on a digital platform and it will be beneficial. So when I say learning activities, for example, I'm referring to things like some learning environments could refer to discovery, which is research and finding things to prepare for class. Digital tools could be very effective for that, for example. I mean, Fred mentioned sort of assessment and regular interactions with students to see how they're doing. That could be good for assessment, I mean, for digital tools. But maybe when we look at things like how do we facilitate group and peer interactions and debates, how do we make sure that we still learn adequately from our peers? How do we ensure that we develop soft skills? And how do we ensure that we develop critical thinking skills? We don't have the research at this point to say that we can effectively achieve those other learning activities or every learning activity on a digital platform. And we need to be very selective, I think, where we want to apply it so that we can do well in certain learning activities and free up resources of teachers to do other things that are more high touch or more complex learning processes. And then we can actually utilize our resources better.
I want to get back to that point about peer-to-peer learning. I think it's a very important one. But before we go there, perhaps, Colin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea of quantity versus quality. It's something that comes up a lot in this debate.
Yeah, right. You know, a provocative phrase, if you like, that Africa doesn't need education. Africa needs education at scale. Because normally, these sessions, we start off with the numbers, and the minister mentioned a few numbers there about out-of-school kids. But we know actually the in-school kids, especially in primary, thanks to the MDGs, you've got classrooms 60, 70 in there. So you've got systems that are not working very well. And you've got demographic forecasts that are going to make those systems work even more poorly. So digital education has to be in the mix. And it's a nuanced approach, you know, as you said. But it has to be in the centre of the mix. Now, what I find when I've talked at debates like this, especially with educationalists, we immediately start talking about quality. And I found that that is where we're more comfortable to talk about quality and different types of interactions and different types of interventions, but not about quantity. And when you talk about big figures, big problems, always, if it can't scale, then there's a trade-off. And we need more expertise in this area around scaling. That's the thing, because that's at the root of this. You know, there's a phrase about fish, right? You know, give a person a fish or teach them to fish. Well, you know, frankly, you don't have to teach them, you know, deep sea fishing or salmon fishing in the highlands. Just give them the basics of how to fish, they'll work out the rest. So this is where I see there's a trade-off where basic, scalable technology can make a big, big size, I'm talking about, impact on this continent.
That raises another interesting point when we talk about the potential, say, of MOOCs for transforming a rural Kenyan kid who can get online and study at Harvard. It sounds great, it sounds fantastic, but then we also have the real fact that there's only 20% of Africans who have access to that kind of internet. 40% don't have access to electricity. So how do we, not to use a word that's become the bad word in this forum, how do we leapfrog that issue, just access to these educational programs? Temi, maybe you want to?
Yes, it's also one of the things that we're looking at in APFL, Swiss Institute of Technology, where we're thinking about how do we build a sustainable solution that is targeted at Africans with Africans in mind, instead of, you know, Coursera is coming from the US, edX, US, bandwidth issues, videos, etc. And one of the keys that we found is also mobile. And to some extent, and the good news now is that platforms, messaging applications are becoming platforms. And if you take Facebook Messenger, for example, it's a platform upon which you can actually build applications. And building education applications on such mobile platforms actually help you to deliver wherever there is Facebook Basic, for example. It's free, it doesn't counter your data, and we can start to enhance access with that. So my concern has always been, how do you use, or how do we use what we have now to solve the problem that we have now? And these are some of those things. Infrastructure and access, they're big challenges, definitely. They're being solved at different levels. But the key issue we have now, some people have mobile phones, some have feature phones. How can we think creatively to bring the solution that probably works elsewhere, or solution that we think is working in a way now, but we need to change the paradigm? And then by changing the paradigm, we can deliver the same quality, but differently. So for me, feature phones are still great, and probably 60% of Africans using phones still use that. Mobile phones, messaging apps, WeChat, WhatsApp, etc. These are wonderful places that even people that do not have telephones or do not have internet access, they have WhatsApp. or they have WeChat or whatever that is, and we can leverage that. So these are things that we are thinking about, and we're saying, how can we create a new model? How can we deliver education effectively in places that are remote or in places where we want people to get it at scale, as you mentioned?
I would add on to that is that I think there's different stages of the solution. Obviously, the end goal is to have ubiquitous internet access, but I think in the meantime, you don't need to have internet access the whole time. You can work with intermittent connectivity. So often we will provide access at the central school or at the actual company where people work, where they can download what they need to do for the next 24 hours or something, and then wherever they live, they don't actually need the internet, and solutions can work in a contained space where they still provide effective value offline, and then when you come online again, you can sort of resync and get your next sort of batch of learning. So I think we need to consider these different stages of the solution, and we don't have to get ubiquitous internet from the beginning.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that. You know, in the era of the sharing economy, the world of Uber and Airbnb and so forth, I think there's some latent assets that we have in Africa that we're not using effectively as we think about education. So for example, one could think of creating like an Airbnb of education, where in every single city in Africa, you have high-rise buildings, a CBD, which is used between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And what does that building has? It has internet access, it has electricity. And there's no one there in the evenings, there's no one there on the weekends. So imagine if you created those centers where young people could come and they have all the internet access and electricity they want. They can get access to the world's best learning resources, online. And then they can use those spaces to engage in peer-to-peer learning, and you can have facilitators popping in and teaching them and so forth, right? So by thinking creatively, I think we can use the limited assets that we have and the technology that we have to design brand new systems. So it's not about copying systems from other parts of the world and bringing them here. We need to say, think completely out of the box from scratch and say, how would you design learning for 21st century with what we have?
Colin, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of like you mentioned feature phones. I mean, I bring one along because nobody can actually remember what they look like. But these things, educationalists actually get horrified when I bring one of these out, because we always think about interactive tools and 3G and 4G and all the rest of it. But this could deliver more books than you or I or anybody in this room has read combined. So tell me that's not a transformational tool, number one. And as you said, there's phases in this. And one of the things I think, we overestimate the power of technology and the cost. So if I say, it's $100 to put a laptop into school, well, then we've got to create content for that laptop. There's another $100. But then we've got to train the teachers, and there's another $100-odd. So the cost of actually doing that is much higher than it appears to be for many governments. And the difficulty of training teachers is incredibly high. So we often get very sophisticated interventions happening, sometimes in refugee camps, and people are putting in tablets with all sorts of interactive material, and we get a panicked phone call from the funder saying, the teachers are saying, where's the curriculum? We just want the books. And we'll start there, we'll move to the interactive stuff, but give us a bridge into this.
Colin raises an interesting point on this side. It's just, historically, education has been in the hands of government. And what we're talking about here is all private sector, more or less. Minister, perhaps you can weigh in on how government can work with the private sector on bringing digital tools to a national education curriculum.
Well, yeah, let me talk a bit first about the issue of connectivity. I think, I was looking at a map yesterday at a ceremony where Facebook and ISAN and Girl Effect was launching, digital solutions for girls, and they were showing, a world's connectivity map, and you really find that 2G, 3G, and then 4G, there is huge disparities in terms of connectivity, and you think you start thinking about why those disparities. I think the answer is it's affordability. It's about the amount of money that needs to be invested in the business model to be able to get the return on investment. But I'm looking at a man who's sitting out there. His name is Vano. He's come up with one of the solutions that allows to deliver broadband to any. That's what he claims. He can maybe talk later. Any rural area of the world in a financially self-sustainable way. So I believe that governments, but he needs a lot of collaboration with the government for such kind of solution to work. So we're working with him in Rwanda, and I know he wants to sort of storm the world with that solution. When it comes to delivering education, again, I think government cannot do it alone. So connecting the schools will only be done effectively by the private sector. But when it comes to challenges like retraining teachers, I think it's a core mandate of the government to be able to do that in a public sector. Now, education cannot also be only delivered by the public sector. A lot of education is done by non-for-profit sector, by the NGOs, by the churches, and they are doing that very well. So I think that tripartite, triple P delivery model with very innovative, private-driven models for delivering connectivity, educational platforms, the kind of mobile-based education platforms that people talk about. I think that partnership is what is going to help us resolve the challenges that we have today.
Partnership, yeah.
I think there's also other spaces, that public sector can cooperate with public sector a lot better, and that is really around the content space. So a lot of times in countries, the actual curriculum is sort of owned by the government and such, and before a private player can work with it and repurpose it onto sort of digital tools, sometimes you need to go through long processes of permissions and things like that. So that's a really easy way to open up the conversation a lot more, actually empower private sector players to have authorized sort of access to work with the curriculum and be updated from the Ministry of Education as to what changes are coming so that you can work your tools around it. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that the teachers are asking for books and whatever's on the curriculum. A lot of the learning tools are great in general, but unless you've mapped it to the local curriculum, teachers can't use it immediately. Teachers are not going to have the time to search for all the open education resources and find what's relevant for the class then. Certainly some good teachers might, but not all. And I think when governments can collaborate better with private sector, we can map and contextualize our learning tools a lot better for the local curriculum.
If I can just interject on the issue of curriculum, I think digital gives us an opportunity to sort of rethink everything. I think the basic premise of having a curriculum in place is to be able to evaluate later, to administer some form of examination. And I think digital allows to challenge that notion altogether. The famous Einstein saying that if you evaluate a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will, spend its entire life thinking it's stupid. Mm-hmm. So, what about training people to do the things they love to do, which are unique? I think digital gives us a possibility of what what it brought to the advertising industry. We used to have, the magazines, and then the same picture you see on the magazine, the same you see in a newspaper, on a roadside billboard, and so on. But today with digital, everyone is served with the most accurate, relevant ad, depending on their preference, interest, location, time of the day, mood, and everything. Mm. So I think education should and will transform to adapt to that new digital reality. And the idea of a curriculum, I think, it would be a very good step in the right direction to allow people to sort of open source curriculum. But I think it will decentralize when education, we reach that tipping point of really digital education.
Great. You raised some good points. I want to open up the audience in just a little bit. Meanwhile, you can always weigh in or comment at #digitaleducation if you have a thought or a question. We'll go through one little round and then go to the audience, but we've brought up the potentials of digital education, but we haven't really looked at the drawbacks. And I know personally, and I'm sure many of you in this room would agree, that what we learn and how we learn best is through our peer interactions, through failing, through starting over again and learning the hard way. Can you get that in digital education, or how do we make sure that we grow the innovators and leaders that we need for Africa today? Fred, why don't you weigh in with that?
Certainly. I mean, so I believe that there is some way to develop some of those innovative skills and skills that people need for the 21st century online through some clever simulations and so forth. But there's only so much that you can do. Because at the end of the day, the old way of learning was one where you just acquired knowledge. Nowadays, if you look at modern research, knowledge is best thought of as something that you construct for yourself and with your peers. And it's very difficult to do that by yourself sitting in front of a computer. If you look at the dropout rates of MOOCs, only 10% of people finish courses that they start, right? So it shows, learning is best done, in social settings, right? So we need to bring people together, especially if you think about the fact that there's a big, the big issue of the 21st century for Africa is creating jobs, right? And getting a job is not only about acquiring knowledge, but it's about having certain skills. Like, how do you work in teams? How do you think critically? How do you communicate? How do you lead yourself? How do you lead others? Those are things that you learn through experience and through interaction. And so therefore, I believe that the best ways of developing people who are actually going to be able to create their own jobs and to actually get employed will be methods of education that blend the best of the online and digital world and so forth with real-world interactive experiences that give them these skills so that they can actually go out and be productive members of society. And so we need to move away from this either-or debate and think about how do we bring the best of both worlds together and create a system.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. If it doesn't, like we were saying before, slow down the scalability of this, I think we do have a forum here and we're allowed to think about what if. But as Madame Grassa-Michel has said this morning, it's kind of like almost show me the money, right? It's like, don't tell me what you're going to do, what we could do, what we'd like to do. What have we done? And what tools have we got now? And you mentioned that. What tools are around now? And what do they allow us to do at scale right now, given the situation is dire at the moment? And it is going to get worse. So, I'm all for saying putting layers of sophistication and modularizing this and personalizing this. And I think that's wonderful. But I think we also are obliged to look at, okay, but what's the fastest way we can actually get basic education out and then begin to layer other things on top of that?
Go ahead.
There is a challenge that we all face, which is the question of frame of reference. Our frame of reference, when we talk about higher education, we think about classroom, auditorium, etc. We need to redefine that definition of what higher education, primary education, or what even classroom means. That's the first thing. The second thing, to build on what you said, is that when you look at what do you want to achieve with education? The end goal is to get a job, have the skills to do the job, etc. Must you be in a classroom? Must you be in an auditorium? Must you be in a lecture hall? Those are the questions we need to challenge so that, and if we use first principles, what are the things that we want to achieve? Now, what we're trying to do at APFL with our partner universities is that we say, let's take online digital tools. Let's take digital pedagogic technologies. Let's take MOOCs, for example. Let's plug it with our partners. Let's create the best content. Let's put that in and use that to fast-track training in an immersive way. Because when you look at just what you said earlier about buildings, when you look at each offices, each enterprises, they have conference rooms, they have production floors. These are great training places. We are planning to put the graduates or our students into those places where they get mentorship and they get hands-on. And at the same time, they're going through online training at the same time that they are working. Fast-track training, immersive, enterprise, hands-on, and at the end of the day, they get a diploma. That, we hope, this is still experimental, we hope that at the end of that program, the enterprises actually know them. They've been trained on the best content possible by the best professors in the world, from the best schools in the world, and the enterprises actually have the choice to say, that guy, he's been working for me for 6 months, for a year, this is the best candidate I want to hire. And coming back to the curriculum or to the content, it's also important that our students start to learn leadership earlier on and entrepreneurship earlier on, so that they're not waiting to get jobs from the government or even from enterprises, so that they have so much skills that at the end of their process or at the end of their training, they can actually think about how can I create a job for myself and create jobs for others. And I think if we put the entire education context and we break it down completely, and we start putting all the pieces and separating the pieces from each other and looking at how we can enhance each of the piece of the education system with technology, we will transform. And Africa has actually a role to play in that.
So do we have to learn in a classroom? It's a very good question, but what about social skills? I mean, is there a risk of being too isolated if we work too digitally? Maybe you want to weigh in?
Sure. I think some of the initial research is showing that there may be some certain risks. Young people today might be sitting at the same table and they're actually talking to each other, but they're talking to each other on WhatsApp and not talking. And these are the same people that are going to have to grow up and enter the business world, and they're going to have to persuade and engage and do real conversations. They're going to have to lead other people. So I think we probably do need to consider how we make sure young people balance that digital experience with that experiential learning and action learning out there in the real world, so that they don't lose out on those soft skills. Otherwise, we'll have a major deficit of people that can't engage outside of a digital context.
I have a tweet coming in that says exactly that. It says, is the purpose of education only for creating jobs? I beg to differ. There is more to it than jobs. Perhaps this is a good time to open to the audience. Does somebody want to weigh in? We have microphones. We have a lady in the back, and then in the front, and then the man in the suit there. And we'll start with 3. We can take it to the panel and then go out again. Go ahead.
Hello, how are you? I'm Faraja, a global shaper from the Arusha Hub, but I also run a social enterprise creating digital educational content for the web and mobile. And what I've seen as a perception issue and as an attitude issue is that the target markets tend to assume that education should be a government domain, should be a freely provided service by the government, and therefore I think that hinders investment in education and investment in how we perceive the markets and the cash flow and the financial model and the business model. So how do we address that? Because I think it's almost a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. And oftentimes I find myself in conversations, such settings, that we're not really dealing with of education in Africa, where it has been a government domain and now it's changing to become a private sector issue. How are we addressing that in our different enterprises? Thank you.
Thank you, Farah.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Oforo. I'm the Executive Director at Pearson. I'm responsible for developing content and learning platforms. One of the challenges that we have in South Africa, for example, which I think obtains elsewhere on the continent, is that when you look at the level of investment in education and weigh it against education outcomes, people are ready to throw their hands in the air because it's very disproportionate. So the question that comes for me when we talk about e-learning is to say perhaps the only reason why we should consider that is on how it improves learner outcomes. We can talk about what we mean about learner outcomes, but if we look at the South African scenario that I talked about, it begins to interrogate the value proposition of e-learning. And in most cases, if you look at the investment, if you look at the dual mode that people use in most cases, if you look at the initial regression in learning outcomes initially, I would like the panel to look at that question to say, when you look at the relationship between education outcomes and the investment, would you then take an approach that suggests that we go full scale, or we go with the type of proposal that she was highlighting? I would like to foreground this by saying I think we should go for e-learning, but only in areas that improve learning outcomes. The obsession with replacement of print by digital just doesn't work, and we have come across it in many ways. So I would like us to interrogate that question between investment and learner outcomes.
Thank you. And then last question here. We'll get you the next one.
Thank you. I'm Michael Rue from Australia, and a very long-standing friend of Rwanda. Listening to the panel, I just wonder whether we put the question incorrectly. I actually don't think it's a choice between digital and non-digital. just like the telephone wasn't between mobiles and non-mobiles, laptops or non-laptops. What we're talking about, I think we have to start with is the purpose of education, what we're trying to achieve, and then how do we use technology to achieve that? And you'll find that there's a myriad of possibilities, and that there will be times when total digital online will serve a particular purpose, and there'll be others where it will enhance the classroom. But you don't come up with the questions about the social issues, because if you're actually clear about what you're trying to do about education, then those questions don't come up. It's just about another area of public policy. It's not public or private. Another area of public policy is where you use technology. So I think the debate's framed incorrectly.
Thank you. Since we'll get to another round of questions after, we'll just start addressing these first. Rapelang, since Brian addressed you directly, let's start with you on the question of e-learning, where it works.
I think both those questions were quite valid. In terms of investment and educational outcomes, I think the general e-learning space and digital learning space is guilty of part of that hype around let's just put tablets in schools and, you know, by osmosis these kids will learn a whole lot better. And a lot of the time it's not even that learning outcomes has regressed, it's learning outcomes have not been measured. So that also undermines further potential in investment because we haven't demonstrated learning outcomes. So in my research, particularly even when I was starting this business, I was looking specifically at what material demonstrates which learning methodologies can be used to improve learning outcomes. And one particular extensive study in the United States was looked at the 22 most cost-effective approaches of improving learner achievement. And in that, they compared various interventions that were considered to improve learner achievement, and they looked at the cost of implementing that approach and how long it takes a learner to get to the same level of proficiency. And these approaches were things like what happens if we pay teachers more, what happens if we only use teachers with postgrad degrees, what happens if all classrooms with 25 learners or less, what happens when we have an extra school year, or if we have better preschool. And they also looked at what happens if we have online digital content. And they also looked at then what happens if we have rapid assessment or rapid reinforcement post-class for learners to reinforce what they learned. And based on that kind of research, I as a company also focused my attention on that rapid reinforcement because they found that rapid reinforcement after classroom was actually the most cost-effective way to improve learner achievement, far and away above all the other interventions. And if we did that kind of diligent research and analytics with these kind of investments that we made, then e-learning would speak for itself. So us as practitioners are also guilty of not doing enough of that. And there is a lot of material that we should align ourselves with when we do these activities as opposed to looking at learning in a broader context. Learning is broken down into a series of activities and there's a series of learning interventions. And one needs to be focused at how you target them.
I'll just add to that, actually, we do a lot of work on learning outcomes in schools. But two things, we don't see it as a digital versus paper thing. It's a digital versus zero books in many, many schools, or a zero flow of relevant, engaging books that are needed for purpose at the time. And the same goes for the teacher support as well. You know, that digital is a way actually to deliver regular teacher support. Even if you just get to one person in the classroom, they're an enabler. But yes, you have to measure that. But then on the wider outcomes, we're talking about in the classroom, we're talking about leadership skills. If they are part of outcomes that are desired, then they should be measured as well. And and that's difficult to do. We know that's challenging, but they should be. But digital does allow us to actually open up the outcomes that we're looking for. It's not just standardized testing improvements.
I think the audience here in this place, we've all gone to very good schools. The question of digital is about outcomes, is when you have gone to school and you're training and you're... The question here in Africa, let's bring this back to the context of Africa. African universities, African primary schools, where there are no schools, right? Where there are no teachers, where the lecture rooms are incredibly crowded. What do you do? How do you handle that? And how do you then use technology? And this is where I'm a bit more radical in my approach, that one, we have no choice. We need to embrace digital to the fullest. We'll learn across the line, along the road, and we will do and adjust. Fred gave example of mobile phones earlier. In Nigeria, Alhaji Aliko Dangote said this morning that we had 500,000 lines of telephone. In 10 years, we had 98 million. This is the kind of scale we are talking about. So how do we achieve that scale How do we put the hundreds of thousands or millions of kids that do not have access to school into school? This is what digital at least can enhance at this level. Once we start to achieve that, in my opinion, we'll be addressing other issues. How do we improve outcomes? How do we improve interactions? How do we, and probably we'll get other creative means to substitute some of the interactions we don't get in classrooms. Probably kids will sit around the trees, they'll have some interactive place to make after they have read their Kindle or whatever support the content comes in. So these are things that we need to consider. The African context is there in terms of education at all levels.
So maybe I can answer her question.
Please.
I think the young lady's question, Sarah? Farah's question was about sort of how do you think about financing this new wave of education and so forth. Perhaps I can share how we're thinking about financing the model of education that we're pioneering. So we're building a network of universities across Africa. The vision we have is to establish 25 campuses with 10,000 students each. So we'll be training 250,000 students at a time. And over a 50-year period, this will develop 3 million leaders and entrepreneurs for Africa. So we're really going for the highest quality, to produce people who can really transform nations and societies. And so when we looked at this, obviously it looks like a very expensive endeavor. At scale, we expect our budget will be about $1 billion a year. How are you going to fund that? So the way we're doing that is two ways. One is we're using differential pricing, where we're asking every student who comes to pay what they can afford to pay. And so even if you can afford $50 or $1,000 or $10,000, we charge you that. And then that brings in a certain amount of income. We're also building the institutions to be of such high quality that we want to attract students from outside of Africa to come and study at these institutions. So we eventually want about 25% of our students to come from outside of Africa, from China, India, USA, and Europe. And they might initially come for a 6-month, one study abroad experience, but over time, if we establish it at such a high quality, that then they'll actually be coming here for the full degrees, and we'll charge them double what we're charging the Africans, so that we can use that to subsidize the Africans, because they've been doing that to us for decades. When you go to Europe, that's what happens, right? So that's part of the solution. But the other thing that we're exploring, and I think this is really what could scale it, is we're exploring something called income sharing arrangements, where the traditional in the West, access to higher education really became possible when governments subsidized student loans, and that's what really drove access to tertiary education, for example, in the USA. Right? In Africa, the governments don't have that money. Interest rates are too high, so borrowing from banks just doesn't make sense, etc. So what we're looking at is a model where we would actually raise a fund from investors, and the fund would then cover the cost of students' education. And when the students graduate, they don't have a loan that they have to pay with a fixed amount every month with interest and so forth. They pay between 5 to 10% of their salary for 10 years. Back to the investors in the fund. And so you create a self-sustaining mechanism where investors come in and they get a return. Young people get educated, and then when they start working, they're able to repay some of that income. And then it's also much more flexible, because if you're unemployed, you don't have anything to pay. If you're working in a low-paying job, you're only paying a certain percent of that, etc. So that model, and Australia has actually done this at a national level. So if you go to a national university in Australia, they tax you 3% for the rest of your life. And that funds 30% of the higher education budget in Australia. And we'll only do ours for 10 years.
I like that idea.
So those are some of the ways we're looking at doing it.
We're seeing one question coming in from Twitter. It says, what about people outside the school system? How do we reach them with digital education, and what kind of education? It's a good point. Somebody want to weigh in?
Well, I think I'll default to mobile, always there. So it's the obvious, right? It's obvious. At scale. I might have said that word before. So I want to bring it back to that. I know a lot of people out of school, and a lot of people that have left school with less skills than they need for the workplace. So, you know, this, when I see education up there, I didn't see school, I saw education holistic, and that's the way, you know, we should all think about this. And that's the opportunity that digital is not a, you know, silver bullet or a panacea. We know that. It has all sorts of weaknesses and all sorts of difficulties on measurement. But boy, is it, especially through the mobile phone network, 2G network reaches 75% of sub-Saharan Africans. That is an incredible superhighway that has been neglected for all sorts of reasons. That is a lever that needs using now, both for in school and out of school. And I would say, I'll just bring it back, the children that we're trying to get to are not at this forum. And they're right across the continent, they're hidden, they're fragmented. But if I was to say, look at Kakuma or Dadaab refugee camp, you've got 500,000 or 1 million people in one space, that crystallizes the need for doing something for education at scale right now. And every child on this continent that's out of school is exactly in the same position there. So I'll just bring it back to scale and time. And there is an urgency around this.
Thank you. I think we have time for just 2 more questions from the audience, and then we'll go back and let everybody weigh in. These 2 gentlemen here have been quite eager.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Coco Kujo from the Grassel Michel Trust. I think the question that came in earlier from Twitter about is education just to service jobs? I think it's an important question because you'll ask, so we get educated to get jobs. Then we have the issues of inequality, we have the issues of gender and all those things. And I ask myself, what platform are we using to address that kind of education?
Okay. And then these 2 gentlemen, they're in the middle row. I think we're going to have to harass all the speakers after the meeting so that we can keep to time.
Okay, thank you. My name is Paulo Kumu with the Africa Platform. 2 very quick questions. We are discussing a lot about content, but last year when we were discussing the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that North America and European governments refused to give was the technology. And so the question is, even whenever you talk about scale or ever talk about everything, what we are actually doing is creating a market for Europe for their technology. And nobody here seems to be speaking about how to bring that technology so that it can not just lower down the cost, but so that we can have something that is much more sustainable. So I would want to hear much more. I don't know whether there's anybody here who is using a mobile phone made in Africa. Probably no one. So that's the question that I think we need to answer. The second one is tied back to that. I'm a bit concerned that we are turning human beings into factors of production, where a lot of what you're talking about is how they can work and what jobs or they can do. And I'm thinking that we need to look at life at much more beyond looking at human beings as a factor of production. So technology does have a role, but if you look at the study that was done by, I don't know whether it is your competitor, the New York Times, is that the dropout rate on e-learning and technology-based education is actually as high as 80%. And that is because of the non-interactive nature. So when you now use education to turn people into a means of production, what happens to that high dropout rate and how do you manage it later on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you think that we have to give priority also how to fight poverty in order to introduce digital technology and digital education? Because I remember I was attending in one of our seminars in Nairobi, and then member of the board of our schools in South Africa, and then patron, of another one school. And the parents, they pay a very high level of fees, nearly $10,000. And there were qualified teachers, there was equipment. So now it's very interesting to open a debate how to get the funds. For example, when there are sponsorships for entertainments, for sports, we may get a special tax, 10% from this money, or even to ask all the business community how to sponsor one school to get the equipment. And then we need to spend time and money for the trade of the teachers. And then, of course, we need also some qualified people to write write books for the workshops and for the introduction of these digital education. And so without this, and without to start in the beginning in 1-2 schools using this as a test, we cannot introduce to all the schools suddenly. We need in the beginning some tests to see the outcome of the results. So my final question is to tell me something about in relation of fighting poverty and introducing digital education. Thank you.
Okay, so we have that. We have just a few minutes. I'm afraid we have no more time for questions. We'll kind of go around the circle, address these questions that just came up, and maybe give your final concluding thoughts so that we can see how we move this discussion forward. Okay, do you want to start, Temi?
I'll respond a bit on the question of transforming education into factor of production, and the fact that we need to remember people's lives. I actually take responsibility for that comment that I made. The objective of education is not just to get jobs, but it's one of the goals, right? There is a lot of things that we need to do in education, but one of the critical things that has to happen is that education has to lead to a decent life and to decent citizens. But what happens when the citizens that are decent have been out of jobs for a long time? What happens when poverty strikes? Arab Spring came because of someone who was out of job and set himself on fire. So we can look at these as factors that actually lead to each other. So, and the question is, which ones can we address, and how can we use technology here to address the part that we can address? So.
I believe that education really is about creating a systematic way of developing the next generation. And in my mind, great education imparts 4 things on people. Number 1, it gives them knowledge, so basic knowledge, how do you read and write and add and so forth. It gives us skills that prepare you for the world of life and for the world of work. The third thing it does, it develops you in a psychosocial way, so emotionally, and helps you think through, it really helps to develop you as a person. And then the fourth thing that I think good education does is it's a way of imparting values, good values into people. And I think of all those 4 things, digital, the way it can have the most impact is on the first, which is giving you some knowledge. But let's not forget the other 3 aspects of a great education. The skills, the psychosocial, and the values. And I think that's how you create a holistic human being who's able to go out and can really impact society. And so that's so I said I see digital as just one element into a broader thing, and that's why we still need to think about the human experience. The final thing I'll talk about is on your question about are we focusing too much on the need for jobs and so forth. I believe that we're not focusing enough on that. We've been through several stages of development in Africa, and we've had different battles to fight at each time. We had to, first there was the colonialism we had to fight, and then we were trying to get political stability and peace. What we haven't tackled is poverty. And we're sitting with the fastest growing population in the world, which is going to, we're going to have a workforce that is going to be larger than China's and India's by 2050. And if we don't find a way to create jobs for these 1 billion people who are going to need jobs, we're sitting on a ticking time bomb. And so I believe that if there's one thing that we accomplish in the next 50 years as Africans, is that we create people who are able to employ themselves and that are employable and can therefore create a mean of livelihood for themselves. Of course, there are other things that we want to do in Africa and that we need to do in society. But this, for me, is the most important thing, and therefore, education must help us achieve that issue, for that objective for Africa.
Well, I'd like to build on what Fred just said. I think there are a couple of other things that we expect to get from education, and that I think traditionally the current education we have is really not providing enough. One is innovation and creativity, and then critical thinking. We've been taught to, in so many schools in Africa, learning and knowledge, stops at memorizing what the teacher has said. And you wonder what kind of workforce we are preparing for the future, given that, according to some estimates, 60% of all jobs that are going to be there in 20 years from now are not even known. The people who are going to create those jobs are not even born yet. So I think the best that we can do is to provide an education that prepares the kids to that kind of future. Just imagine 20 years from now, how many driverless cars are we going to have in the roads in the US? I'm not talking about Africa. We're still doing the roads. But you cannot imagine, driving is the single most biggest employer. You know, that's a job that employs the most people in the United States. And you're here in the opening plenary this morning when the guy from McKinsey said that we need to put in place, 6 to 10 weeks retraining programs for people to be back in, to get to take another career opportunity. I think all those things cannot even be conceived without digital. So I'm a very big believer in digital, and I'm so because I know that there are other forces. So at least the ones who are pushing for digital need to be there and be very strong. And then there is going to be an ecosystem. And I want to recognize my colleague, Minister of Education, who just made it to the room. Maybe he can wave to us. Yesterday, there is no way you can push digital if the ministers of ICT and education are not talking to each other. And our relationship is so strong that we can allow ourselves to say it's like husband and wife, but don't ask us who's the husband and who's the wife.
To address some of the questions that came up, I think around the questions of whether we can use digital learning around life skills and developing more holistic people, I think, again, it's important to come back to what do we know for sure technology can do well now? Because if we focus on those things, you relieve resources for other things. What if we shrunk down the amount of time you spend on maths or science or physics, because now we can do it so much more efficiently and we've got more time for life orientation. So it's not to find a silver bullet, one solution for everything. Find something that can be done really efficiently. And to add to what Fred was saying around the things that education can achieve, knowledge and skills and things like that, he said that only sort of knowledge, and I think that digital tools can be used to also dramatically improve skills. And that's one of the areas I've been focusing on, because I think to speak to the broader theme of this panel is that we've got this massive, huge dividend, and we've got to leverage this huge number of young people. So we can't keep learning and building skills the same way we've been doing before. We've got to introduce new efficiencies, and we've got to leapfrog how some of those things are done, so that we can actually benefit from this sort of youth bulge that's coming through now.
Yeah, I'm going to set jobs and skills aside and talk about gender. Every piece of evidence that we have at World Reader is that when we give access to books on mobile phone or on e-reader or whatever it is, girls are taking advantage way more than boys. Boys are taking advantage, but the the educational impact in schools is double within a year. And on mobile phone, girls are reading 5 to 6 times. They read more than boys, more often, and for longer periods of time. So as a lever of social justice and equity in society, digital has a big part to play. 2 years ago, we were in Lagos, and we're in the midst of the news that 300 girls had been kidnapped. If there's anything that crystallizes, for me, not what we think about education, but what people who need education think, those girls and their families risk their life every day to go to school, to what is a pretty poor education, because they recognized that there are powers that are against education, but it's worth, education is the only path out of poverty for many, many people on this continent. So, set aside what kind of I think the power or the potency of education. I know people on this continent in need recognize the critical importance of education.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, the audience, for coming, my panel for opening up many questions and discussions. I think as we take this question forward and outside into the rest of the forum, it might be worthwhile thinking back to Africa's past for a moment. Africa was home and is home to the world's oldest university in Timbuktu. So maybe as we talk about a digital future, let's think about how to bring an educational digital future for Africa based on that idea of a crossroads of interaction and knowledge in the middle of Africa. So I send that out with you this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your conference.